All right. Good afternoon. Sarah, I see you're here. So I just want to make sure I'm Professor Wiggatow from Monroe. I want to make sure that I pronounce your name correctly. It's Sarah Urie, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. Thank you. Just wanted to make sure I'm pronouncing it correctly. And I see a couple of other people. Sarah, if you can just make sure and check you can share your screen. This is the first time I've ever used Zoom. So I'm sure I was told everything should be set up. It looks like you can do that. Beautiful. Thank you. I appreciate it. All right, let's see who else is here. Jazlynn Aguon. Did I say that right, Jazlynn?
Jazlynn Aguon.
Aguon. Okay. Let me just write so I make sure I spell it. I say it correctly when I introduce you.
Yeah.
All right. And then if you could just check to make sure that you can share. I just want to make sure that you four can share. Jolisse, I will do you next. I don't see Maria yet. The one I know, I don't see. Okay, beautiful. Excellent. Thank you. And Jolisse Gray, correct?
Yes,
right.
that is correct.
Great. And if you could just check and make sure you guys can share. Or you can share, excuse me. Perfect. All right, so we're just missing figures. The one I know, Maria, she'll be here. I know her. You three guys, the order I have listed, they told us they want us to go in the order, is Jazlynn again first, Jolisse Gray second, Maria Reyes third, and then Sarah Urie fourth. Okay. And I guess each of you guys have about 15 minutes. Was that what you were told? Beautiful. Okay. The only thing I wanted to ask you guys is how do you want to do questions? I was thinking of asking people to put questions in the chat. We have 4 speakers, so that's probably going to be a little tight on time at the end. We could probably do a couple of questions in between each of, like after each one of you speaks if you'd like, or we can just wait for questions until the end. Which would you guys prefer? I'll leave it up to you. You know, think about it. You got a few minutes.
I'm fine with questions at the end because I wouldn't want to take time away from anyone else's presentations.
Okay.
Although I am last, so if anybody's presentation is getting taken away from, it's probably mine. But
I understand. I appreciate what you're saying.
I'm from Baltimore, so I can talk fast. So if I have to talk fast,
right. Maria, when she comes on, she's from New York, so she should be able to talk fast too, just like me. All right, good. Not that you guys can't talk fast. I don't want to make any implications. But what I also figured I was doing is I was going to ask people to put questions. That's what they've been doing so far, and you guys have probably seen this in other presentations as well. This is the first time I'm doing this not in person. Well, I guess I am in person, but you know what I mean. So I think I'm going to ask people to put questions in the chat. And if you guys, as you speak, if you guys want to answer questions in the chat, you're more than welcome to do that. As we go through, I have the chat open, so I should be able to see that fine. So, all right, good. We'll start right around 2:30. I'm just waiting, as we said, we're just waiting for Maria to make sure she can come on and share. Do you guys have any questions? I'm sure you're all prepared and ready to go. All right, I'm going to go ahead and start. Welcome to this session, which is titled Global Power Structures. I'm Bruce Wiggatow. I am a professor at Monroe College in the Bronx. I'm very honored to be moderating today's session. We do have 4 speakers, 3 of which are here right now. I do understand that the 4th one will be here shortly. And so let me quickly introduce all 4 of them, and then I'll let them go ahead and get started. So I have first Jazlynn again from Frederick Community College. She'll be the first speaker. She'll be followed by Jolisse Gray from Notre Dame of Maryland University. And then Maria Reyes from Monroe College, hopefully. And then Sarah Urie, also from Notre Dame of Maryland University. So not to waste any more time, I'm going to ask those of you who are in the audience, if you have questions, if you could put those questions into the chat room. With 4 speakers, we are going to be a little tight on time at the end, so we figured we'd hold all of our questions till the end. And I did ask the speakers that they could answer questions, or inform them they could answer questions in the chat box as well during the course of the presentations or after their presentations. So without further ado, let me introduce Jazlynn again from Frederick Community College. Jazlynn, you can share your screen and begin whenever you're ready.
Thank you. So hi, I'm Jazlynn from Frederick Community College, and today I have a presentation for you about the South China Sea territorial disputes. So what they are, how they became a highly debated issue in international politics, and what are some ways that we could resolve it. So before we get started, we have to know a couple of terms related to international law established by the United Nations or the UN. And so the first one is the Exclusive Economic Zone, also known as the EEZ. And it basically states that 200 miles off the coast of a country designates that they have special rights for fishing, drilling, and other exploration and exploitation of natural resources. And so these EEZ guidelines are a part of the United Nations Conventions on the Law of the Sea, which is known as UNCLOS, and this designates what countries can and can't do in certain areas. So the UNCLOS is connected to the United Nations Charter, and this charter communicates that governments a part of the UN must abide by the charter and its international laws. And so another organization that's related to the UN and almost as important as the UN is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN for short. And this is comprised of 10 Southeast Asian countries like Malaysia, Vietnam, and the Philippines, and they are aimed to protect the social and economic interests of that region. And so the ASEAN signed the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the SCS, which basically states that the territorial disputes must be settled using peaceful means instead of military aggression. So we need to understand why the SCS is such a hotspot for international attention. And one of the major reasons is that because it is significant to expanding the global economy. And so a report by China Power stated that about $3.37 trillion worth of trade passes through this region in 2016, and since then the number has continued to grow. And another reason why is because it's said that this region is home to billions worth of natural resources. This is untapped oil, gas reserves, and fish. So this conflict started after World War II, when countries wanted international peace and general welfare. And in order to establish this, they had 2 treaties, the Treaty of San Francisco and the Treaty of Taipei. Now, the most important or relevant one is the Treaty of San Francisco of 1951. And this is also known as the Treaty of Peace with Japan. And it basically states that in Article 2, Japan renounces all right, title, and claim to the Spratly Islands and to the Paracel Islands. Now, these are clusters of islands in the region, and the reason why they are significant to the SCS is because during World War II, Japan used these islands and to control their military stance in the region. And the real problem stems in Article 4, which rules that any property listed in Article 2, so the clusters of the islands, they must be returned to the previous owner. But because the treaty doesn't exactly state who the previous owner is, it gives a window for these countries to come in and claim whatever is left. And since it's such a broad treaty, this forms the Scs Conflicts, which is a series of ongoing disagreements where multiple countries can claim the same islands and other maritime features like rocks, reefs, and shoals. And so on the left of this image, you can see a red 9-dash line, and this encompasses about 80% of the region of the SCS. And this states that China has indisputable sovereignty over this area. So one question is China's 9-dash line legitimate? And well, because they control 80% of the region, this has posed a lot of debate about what can be done in this region. And the UN has already claimed that their 9-dash line is illegitimate, meaning that they don't have power over 80% of the region. But China, their government has already claimed that they are not going to abide by the UN's how do you say, like their UN's, they're not going to abide by what the United Nations has said because historically they said that they have controlled this region. So they have continued to operate as they see fit. And one of the major operations that they've been conducting is constructing artificial islands. And they have been allegedly using this to store their warships and other military weaponry. And so although it may not be their intent to pose a military threat, it certainly does on the ASEAN point of view, because they're smaller countries in the region and they don't have a big enough influence as China does. And so in order to combat this and help the ASEAN, the United States has been conducting FONOPs, or Freedom of Navigation Operations. And what this does is they sail into Chinese illegitimate territory, and by doing this, they challenge their claims and they're supporting the other nations. Now, even though China's artificial islands have been deemed illegal, the US FONOPs, some of them have also been deemed illegal as well. And so you have this whole big of a conflict, and now you have to bring in the global pandemic. The reason why this is significant is because before the pandemic, China and the ASEAN have been working to build a code of conduct, which basically says that they will have peaceful negotiations. And this was set to finalize in 2022, so next year. But because of the global pandemic and other things that have been happening, it has been raising tensions. And so 2022, this date has been pushed to 2024 and even as far as 2028. So during the global pandemic, it was expected that this issue would be on pause or on hold until everyone was situated. Well, during this, China has actually continued their operations. And so these other countries and the US have seen it as taking advantage of the situation to stay a step ahead. And so we have Vietnam and China clashing with their fishing vessels, and also the Philippines teaming up with Vietnam to warn China about the global pandemic. And I do have a quick video to share with you.
Just last year, Filipino fishermen accused a Chinese vessel of sinking their boat and abandoning them. And yet, China has remained a close ally of President Rodrigo Duterte. But in a statement supporting Vietnam, the Philippine government reminded China that with the threat of COVID-19, what is needed most is unity and mutual trust. Marked below, Al Jazeera, Manila.
So what Barnaby Lowe stated is that we need unity and mutual trust in order to resolve this conflict. Well, that's what I have been based on my research is to analyze international laws and combine it with establishing unity and mutual trust so that this solution or these solutions can resolve the conflict. So the first one I have is the bilateral compromise, and it is applying intermediary diplomacy. Now, the bilateral compromise comes from China wanting bilateral negotiations. What this means is that China versus another country has to negotiate on such territory. Well, intermediary diplomacy gets rid of one-on-one negotiations and includes a third party to help mediate the negotiations. And by doing this, it helps establish trust so that underhanded tactics aren't used, and it helps develop effective communication between the two claimants. And so an intermediary, a third party, could be a high profile or a low profile organization. It could be the United Nations, or it could be as just a business person to help negotiate the global trade. And another solution is based off of the phrase sharing is caring, and it applies both economic and intermediary diplomacy, but it builds more on economic diplomacy because of how it's structured. So think of a Venn diagram. You have China on one side and say the Philippines on the other side. And because they have shared territory in the middle, they have to, or by this auditing mechanism that I'll be talking about, they'll have to compromise whatever's in the middle, say fish or oil. They would have to compromise that and either use it mutually or designate who gets to keep it. And so because countries share territory, they would have mutual sovereignty. And so this would relate to limiting the exploitation of resources, because as you have two countries fighting over the same region, they are more focused on the politics rather than the actual amount of resources they're exploiting. And so by inherently putting an auditing mechanism where they have to negotiate and compromise with each other, this sharing is caring method could act as an incentive for these countries to actually negotiate so that they don't have to share territory and that they establish a clear boundary line between the two regions. And so together we have the bilateral compromise and sharing is caring. And these are two methods that are meant to promote international peace and economic prosperity, and also to steer away from military activity. And so as we heard from Barnaby Lowe from Al Jazeera, he stated that there needs to be unity and mutual trust. And that's exactly what the bilateral compromise and the sharing is caring methods do for the South China Sea conflict. So with more research, I think that this could act as a skeleton or a foundation for what could be included in the code of conduct, or what could be included for researchers and experts to designate a third party. Thank you. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you. I forgot that. I have my cats in the background, so I wanted to mute while you guys are speaking. That was great. Excellent job. A lot of interesting stuff I knew nothing about. I love learning stuff at these conferences. You did a great job. Thank you. All right. If you guys have any questions, again, the audience, if anybody has any questions, please type them into the chat box. We're going to try to get through all four of the speakers, and then whatever time we have left, they will try to answer the questions. Although, as I said, they can also answer the questions if there are any presented in the chat box during the course of the presentation.
Hey, Jazz,
Okay.
I have one question. How much change has happened in this area or in this situation since you started work on this project?
So initially, we had a lot of the media saying that China was very aggressive and that the United States had to come in and fight against China for the ASEAN. But now the United States has sort of laid back on their international policy. And so we see more of China and the ASEAN negotiating rather than China and the US negotiating. So that's a huge change that happened within like the past year and a half.
So since the pandemic.
Yes.
Really? Yeah. Makes sense. Okay. Thank you. All right, so our second speaker today is from Notre Dame of Maryland University, and it's Jolisse Gray.
Hi everyone, I am Jolisse Gray. I am from Notre Dame, Maryland University, and I will be presenting a paper called The Trap Giant and answering this question of will the People's Republic of China become the new hegemon? So the structure of my argument, I take the realist perspective that China will not be the next global hegemon due to hegemonic conditions that China does not fulfill. This includes their military disadvantages, their economic inefficiencies, and their unsustainable ideology in a leadership model. And I also pose that potential Chinese hegemony is a threat because of the actions in the South China Sea, in Taiwan. And I also bring up a case of a Sino-American Cold War, and then I will provide solutions to curb Chinese homogeny. So the conditions for homogeny are very specific. Particularly, the first one is a projective political power that is backed by a military force, particularly a navy. The second one is economic strength, which is marked by an era of financial expansion that allows the country to unseat the prior hegemon. And the last is cultural homogeny, which is the desire and the responsibility to take up the system. So in analyzing their military disadvantage, China has a very ambitious strategy in terms of creating a world-class military that wants to create an active defense force against military, foreign affairs, and regional threats. And this is going to be implemented using a rapid military modernization strategy through the People's Liberation Army and the People's Liberation Navy. And it's focused on offensive strategies of geostrategic areas, mainly in Taiwan and the South China Sea. This is all to get a global presence and to enforce a Chinese economic order and political order that is favorable to them. So this infused model of societal conditions and economic growth is in theory sound. However, when analyzing China, this is a very centralized one-party state and will need meticulous policy formulation in order to be successful. But going into China's military in general, they have 2.8 million soldiers, both in the PLA and the PLAN, and that is double the amount of American soldiers. They have allocated almost 50% of their budget to military expenditures, which has also increased their number of warships that they have. Now they're at 350, while the United States has 293. When thinking of these numbers, we may think that because they have more military vehicles, they are far more superior. However, we have to keep in mind that China is retiring old single-mission warships in favor of large multi-mission warships that are equipped with anti-air, anti-submarine, and anti-sea. This is juxtaposed to the United States that owns nuclear-powered submarines, advanced aircrafts, cruisers, and destroyers. And then when looking into their defense budgeting, they only have $178.2 billion. Half of the United States expected to support double the amount of soldiers. This does not account for the capital needed to focus on training, deploying, and sustaining a modern force. It also does not budget into 57 million veterans that require retirement benefits, pensions, and subsidies. And lastly, they lack no real combat experience. On the right corner, you can see Chinese soldiers using VR headsets, and they have a peace disease. This is marked by usually a stronger military is equipped with a well-trained military that requires training conditions similar to combat and that is coupled with an experienced commander. And as you can see, this is comparing diesel attack submarines from the Chinese, and from the right are nuclear-powered warships from the United States. So going into economic inefficiencies, there are structural flaws from the Hukou system. China has been marked with the fastest sustained economic growth. However, this is very short term due to the very expensive policies that already are seeing a sharp decline. The Chinese growth has marked from 14.2% to a measly 6.6% now. The Chinese have not created inefficient and innovative strategies to combat environmental degradation, overinvestment, corporate rates, and considerable income equality, heavy indebtedness. And the biggest issue is their consumption rates. The growing population has posed an issue, and that's only been exacerbated by the elderly population and declining of skilled workers. And additionally, there's about 170 million workers generally who are unemployed, creating that gap between skill in the economy, as well as there are 106 million rural workers that are unemployed, creating a slowdown on the agricultural expansion. And this is particularly alarming considering that Chinese industrialization growth has been due to agricultural expansion. The reliance on heavy industry has created zombie enterprises, which do not meet the success and do not meet the supply and demand of those of consumers, and fail to stimulate other economic sectors that are important to diversification and the success of an economy. And lastly, the sharp decline of investors has not only been to the gross violations of human rights that China has, but also Chinese aggression in the South China Sea and Taiwan. We can see here, there are unemployment statistics showing that China is declining, as well as their growth. So moving into an unstable ideology and leadership model, the Chinese government is a highly centralized, bureaucratic, authoritarian government. Most of the politicians are of steel workers and steel businessmen, and the political positions place personal connections higher above the law. This self-enrichment and short-termism to political positions has been shown to not be successful in many cases, which we cannot say that China is not an anomaly. So this corrupted political system and temperamental ideology that China has resulted in China's weak commitment to human rights and resistance to social autonomy, and has created this Orwell-like surveillance system. And this surveillance system is unable to give the legitimacy to the government on an international scale that China is hoping, or even it can't give it onto a regional scale. In ways it works domestically, but it cannot in an international system that the hegemon would need to control. Furthermore, going into the human rights, they are evading international proceedings, customs, and norms and laws that have been built by the United States. In ways, they are the only country of power that is non-democratic and authoritarian, so they are an anomaly. And their hopes and desires of trying to change the system to Chinese favor is very unlikely. And lastly, in terms of leadership, the ability to cultivate long-term trustful alliances will be needed in their desire to break down the American blockade in terms of economic power, political power, norms, and customs. But China only has one strategic alliance, and that is North Korea, which is known to have been unstable, has been unreliable, and has been a very aggressive power. And we can see here, talking about the blockade that the United States has created in terms of customs and economics, most of the countries that are seen disapproving with China are Western countries, as well as right on to the right-hand side, Japan has very, very unlikely favorability towards the Chinese. So if we were to think of potential Chinese homogeny, what do we think? So the survival in an anarchic international system is becoming a regional hegemon and eventually challenging the international hegemonic order. However, if the United States' ideological dominance is entrenched in the economy and political institutions that were set up after World War II, these set ideologies cannot be easily dislodged without conflict. Thus, survival in the anarchic system for China will be to continue to go head-to-head with the United States, as well as the United States trying hard to defend its geostrategic regions. So looking at the South China Sea, the South China Sea is a hotbed for relations for many different reasons. There's rocky relationships with the ASN and the 9-dash line, and this is due to China evading international laws. And as I mentioned before, China's success is only really marked by them playing outside of the barriers, them ignoring international court rulings, which was seen when the Philippines was granted jurisprudence over parts of the South China Sea, but China continues to ignore these. And what's particularly interesting about the South China Sea is that there is the Shanghai Park Communique of 1972. and this is a detente between the United States and China that states that no country can claim hegemonic tendencies in this region, which already is being abused by China. So this will make it a hotbed, as the United States wants to protect the ASN, which gives them military bases, economics, and all those countries on the Nine-Dash Line are the highest weapons buyers of the United States. But what's particularly concerning is the Coast Guard law, which China recently put out in 2021, which states that any foreign power, which they made sure to highlight the United States, if they were to come into the South China Sea, they will be met with preemptive strike measures because China is trying to create favorable conditions for them. So just this alone in that law is claiming that this military rapidization strategy is nationalistic and that China has hegemonic desires not only regionally, but globally, and is seeing the South China Sea as a place to exercise its own power. But now we go into Taiwan. So Taiwan is important because not only is it embedded into Chinese history, it's seen as a nationalistic goal that will continue to prop up the legitimacy of this authoritarian nation. Taiwan itself is a geostrategic area because it will increase trade relations and can strengthen the Chinese military coercion methods with all the other Southeast nation countries. But what's alarming is the gray zone strategy. And this gray zone strategy is, the goal is to try to capture Taiwan peacefully and have a peaceful unification from the one China principle. However, this hasn't been happening, so the Chinese have been ramping up their strategy. And this includes evading airspace. They've been seen throughout 2020 to fly over areas that they're not supposed to in Taiwan. They have told other countries that see legitimacy in Taiwan to cut off relations or they won't get coronavirus equipment and medical and medicine. They have been known to force international organizations to write in Taiwan as a province of China, so not recognizing their sovereignty or autonomy. This itself is alarming because the United States and Taiwan have a very close relationship, and the United States will continue to see Taiwan as the key to curbing Chinese homogeny, while China will see Taiwan as the ticket to their regional homogeny. But going into a possible Sino-American Cold War, the tendency to rely on self-help resulting in the security dilemma and arms race is already happening. Both of these powers do have nuclear capabilities. China has already been seen secretly developing a fourth aircrafter that does have nuclear capabilities. And China's aggression is only increasing in the South China Sea and Taiwan. And this dominance will require a Monroe Doctrine style motive. And this Cold War, because America wants to keep their homogeny, they will mobilize their alliances and Asian alliances to increase their military presence. France has already been seen going through the artificial islands that the South China and China has placed to try to curb their homogeny. But when we think of this Cold War, we can't think of it as the Soviet Union and the United States. This one will be marked by technological innovation and economic norms for trade, investment, and intellectual property. We already saw this with the Trumponomics tariff war in 2019, but we continue to see it as the United States is rapidly developing AI, drones, and other intellectual and technological innovative mechanisms. But how can we curb Chinese homogeny? So the National Defense Report of 2020 states that we need to expand the competitive space, seizing the opportunity to challenge the competitor. I do not agree with this for many reasons. Containment is an outdated strategy that has been seen as encirclement. No matter what the Chinese do in terms of defensive strategies, the United States will increase their military operations and arm their alliances, which will only increase tensions with the Chinese government. Thus, we must align ourselves and bolster our allies in geostrategic regions. We must rely on deterrence through soft power and alliances, and we must reinsert the values and purposes of the Indo-Pacific strategy and the Taiwanese Relation Acts. Thus, a mixture of a balancing act of coalitions, economic incentives, values, and customs will not only curb Chinese homogeny, but it will keep the peace and stability of the international order. Thank you so much for your time today. I will be answering questions whenever we are allowed to do so. Thank you.
Is that your last one?
You need to turn your mic on.
I keep forgetting to do that. Thank you. Sorry. As I was trying to say, or as I was saying to nobody but my cat, that if anybody has a question or two, we could probably take some time now because a couple of the first two presentations have been a little shorter than 15 minutes. So we do have a little bit of time if anyone has a question or two. Okay. If not, you can type your questions into the chat box and we'll get that at the end. Jolisse, that was a great job. You did a really excellent job. Both the first two have been fantastic, as I'm sure the next two will be as well. So next I will bring up from Monroe College, my college, Maria Reyes. How are you doing, Maria? Who I know well. You can go ahead and share your screen, and then Maria, you can start whenever you are ready.
All right, let's do that. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen now.
Okay.
Oh, Professor Wigatel, is it possible
Yes.
for you to share my screen, please? Share my presentation. I was trying to do it, but it's not working.
Sure. Let me give you my email address. Just send it to me and I'll open it up and share it on my end. You probably know my email address, but just in case.
In the meantime, I think Sarah had a question for one of the presenters from earlier.
Okay. Did she put it in the Dropbox? I did not notice. Oh, yes, there it is, Sarah. I apologize. What avenues, this is for Jazlynn, what avenues did you see for future research?
If you mean future research as in like experts researching, I see a lot, well, because the US has like sort of taken a back seat recently, not as aggressively as before, we don't see a lot of the media focusing on what the US can or can't do. So I see a lot of the research going into how the ASEAN and China, how they can cooperate culturally and economically. But also I think research would probably go into like how the US alliance, like a supportive backseat alliance, would raise tensions probably like indirectly. And then also for future international laws, because the UN has a lot of loopholes, then they would actually have to refurbish their laws to ensure that US phone ops and artificial islands and things of that nature, like loopholes, won't be able to be implemented by the ASEAN instead. So that's probably some ways that it could go.
Thank you so much. I was just wondering because I know when I do my research, I oftentimes find that there's a bunch of other topics I find along the way that I'm really interested in. So I was just wondering if you had found anything on your, research journey that, pointed you in another direction. So, but thank you for answering the question.
Yeah, real quick, one of the major concerns of my research was that a lot of what was being put out was by American journalists and American researchers. So you could see a clear bias in how the research was pertaining to. But I think in the future, I would rather want to see more Chinese and more ASEAN publications out, just to have a balance and try to navigate the bias instead, to actually like create a foundation, or actually like unbiased potential solutions, if that makes any sense.
Great, great. All right, you guys can see Maria's presentation now, correct? I just want to make sure before I continue on.
Okay. Or if you want, Professor, maybe let's, I don't know, and maybe try zooming in a little bit. And I think we should be good.
Okay, can you see it okay? Wait, I'm not.
Yes, yes, I can.
Okay, just
Okay.
making sure.
All right. All right.
All
Hello, everyone. Sorry for the inconvenience. And let's get started. Okay. So my presentation today is on the voices of Latin America, the struggle for power. This is a little bit of information about everything that has been going on in Latin America for the past maybe 2 years, especially considering the civil insurrections and the political instability of the region. So I decided to do some research, and not only that, but also to actively participate in one of the protests that I'm gonna share right here. So I hope that my experience and both the information that I will give you is, successful for all of you. So let's get started. So first of all, we have our agenda. The agenda for today, we're going to begin giving a little bit of context on the nature of the protest. Then we're going to talk about 3 different countries. First is Venezuela with the civil insurrection. Later, we have Chile with the social outbreak. And we're going to end with Dominican Republic, the youth movement, which was the protest that I was part in 2020. So then we're going to go over to our conclusion, questions, if you have any, and then our references. Okay. So first of all, I want to give you a little bit of context on the nature of this protest. So the first thing that you need to know about Latin America is that Latin America is considered a group of 20 sovereign countries, as many of you know, located in the Western Hemisphere, where Roman languages such as Spanish and Portuguese are predominantly spoken. So the thing about Latin America is that these countries are mostly known both for their vast amount of resources, as well as for their deplorable political and economic condition. So many would even argue that Latin America could easily be a developed region if it wasn't for the leaders that rule it. So although it is possible to argue that Latin Americans themselves have provoked these problems by electing their own leaders, the thing is that their political campaigns are far too convincing for an almost illiterate and neo-colonized region. So Latin American citizens are familiar with suffering at the hands of their rulers, and corruption is one of the main causes of this, as you could see in the next slide. So corruption is one of the main reasons, as well as foreign interventions, as you can see over here, is another persistent problem in Latin America, or it's probably not something that has happened very recently, but in a way, because foreign countries have intervened in Latin America in the past, it has left a little bit of a feeling even in our present times. So as well, so we have foreign intervention, which is something that really affects Latin America. We also have corruption, as you can see in the next slide, and the establishment of dictatorships. And we also have another situation, which is, as you could see in the next slide, we have the dictatorships. And then on the other one, we also have, which would be the political, social, and economic crisis that Latin America has had over the past couple of years. But yeah, so now that we understand a little bit of the nature and the context of this protest, we're gonna get started with Venezuela, with the civil insurrection. So I want to give you a little bit of historical background in Venezuela, because the situation in Venezuela is very complicated, but even though it's very important to understand the historical background. So let's get on to that. So with the historical background right here, it is important to me 2 very important figures right now. We have Hugo Chavez and we have Nicolas Maduro. So with Hugo Chavez, we can say that everything started with this man. Hugo Chavez, he gained popularity during the elections of 1999, and then he was finally elected president. He was considered a dictator because he stayed in office for 15 years. during his time in office, we can say that he was well liked by most Venezuelans, but he obviously had a part of the country that wasn't really in favor of him. But then he died in 2013, and the man that followed him is Nicolás Maduro. Nicolás Maduro is the current president of Venezuela, and I'm putting quotation marks because you're gonna understand that situation a little bit better now. But it started in 2014. He became president of Venezuela, and he got reelected in 2018. Although many people have established many false accusations against him because they believe that the only reason why he got elected president is because he established a dictatorship in Venezuela. So now that we understand who these two people are, we can understand who is Juan Guaido. Juan Guaido is the opposition leader, and he's the interim president of Venezuela. He labeled Nicolás Maduro an usurper and declared himself president of the nation in the meantime until things get resolved. So this is Juan Guaido. So now we understand all of this historical background. I also want to let you know that Venezuela still possess the world's largest crude oil reserves, and they have been, or they were at a certain point, a stable democracy and one of Latin America's fastest rising economies until, all the way until things happened with Nicolás Maduro and Hugo Chavez. So this is a small timeline so you guys can see. Obviously, I think these presentations will be available for you to review after, but this is just for you to get an idea of the situation in Venezuela. So everything started in 2013 when Hugo Chavez died, and then the protests started around 2017, and then in 2018, Juan Guaido declared himself president. So this is a timeline, and now let's get on with the event and let's understand what happened. So the event in Venezuela. So the situation in Venezuela is that in December of 2016, opposition parties won a majority of the National Assembly, and the legislature became thorn in President Maduro's side. So in response to that, he created the National Constituent Assembly, made up exclusively of government supporters whose powers supersede those of the National Assembly. So these two bodies have been at loggerheads ever since. So this is a situation in Venezuela, and then after that happened, we have the situation with Juan Guaido that you're gonna see right here. So Maduro was re-elected in 2018, but the poll was widely dismissed as rigged. So after Maduro's inauguration, the Venezuelans took the streets, and with Juan Guaido leading the opposition. So Juan Guaido decided to declare himself president, but the protests have continued ever since then, and he has been working actively with different countries to solve the situation in Venezuela. So now let's get on with the resolution. Let's understand what's happening right now. So the resolution to this problem in Venezuela has been mostly, I would say, accompanied by the United States. And now you understand that. So the resolution is that the US has sided with Mr. Guaido, with Juan Guaido, and they have imposed sanctions on Mr. Maduro, and they have also imposed sanctions on the Venezuela's oil industry, and they have made it very hard for him to get fuel and foreign currency in the country. So meanwhile, opposition parties have been divided over strategy. They have tried to boycott legislative elections, and the National Assembly looks set to come under control of Mr. Maduro's party as well. So this is Venezuela. Now let's get on with Chile. So Chile, in order to understand the social outbreak in Chile, is very important to understand a very famous dictatorship that took place in Chile. So first things first, we need to understand who is Sebastián Piñera. Sebastián Piñera is the current president of Chile. He was re-elected in 2018, and ever since then, tensions have increased in Chile significantly. And then we also have Pinochet. So Pinochet, Augusto Pinochet, he was a dictator in Chile. He was elected president in 1973, and he stayed in office all the way until 1990, so almost like 17 years. So the situation with this man, with Augusto Pinochet, is that he imposed a new social economic model inside of the country. So this goes a lot with the historical background. So the Pinochet's dictatorship imposed the new economic model, and this economic model privatized health, education, and pensions. So this system, even though even though Pinochet's dictatorship ended in 1990, this system has persisted all the way until to 2021 and on all of these years, so 30 years. So not all Chileans have benefited from this policy. So that has made things very difficult for people. So you can see here on the timeline that things started around 1980s when he changed the constitution to put this new economic model. And then around in 2019, the Chileans decided to take the streets and begin protesting because the government decided to increase the subway fares, making it very difficult for people to access transportation. So that's when the protest started. And now we can go over to understand the event and the whole situation here. I want you to pay very close attention to this picture right here. So this picture, the main reason why these women are covering their eyes is because during the protest, the police and the people and the people in law enforcement were told to use the hardest of the methods in order to quell the protest. So they would hurt the protesters with rubber bullets in their eyes, as you can see right here, and most of them were injured during this time. Regardless, they still continued, so which is really inspiring, I would say. So in October of 2008, October 2019, it was October 18. Like I said, the students began protesting against the spike in the subway fares. So despite the deaths, the multiple people that were injured, these protesters continue to persist in Chile still to this day. So the Chilean president, Sebastián Piñera, he declared the Chile in a state of emergency, and he deployed 10,000 troops to use these very harsh methods that I told you about. So this is Chile. Now let's go over to the resolution so we can understand what's gonna happen next. So the resolution in Chile is that they have decided to impose to change the economic model that Piñera established, and they will elect 155 new citizens to draft the new constitution to change the situation. So we're running a little bit out of time, so let's get on with DR and let's learn about the situation. This is all what I just described previously, that they're gonna elect new citizens to draft the new constitution, and these citizens will actually be elected tomorrow. So be in the lookout for that. So in the Dominican Republic, we have the youth movement that I told you that I was a part of. So the youth movement in the Dominican Republic started in 2020. 2020 was around the time when we could say that we were going to have new elections, but something happened in these new elections. So for you to understand that, you need to meet Danilo, who was the president at the time. He was president of the Dominican Republic from 2012 all the way into 2020 when new elections were held. He was reelected in 2016. Now we also have another important person who is Luis Abinader. He is the current president of the of the Dominican Republic. But actually, the situation with him is that during this time, he was only a presidential candidate. He was only being, doing his campaigns and things like that. But he really wasn't a part of the situation. But it's important to be aware of him. And now we can get on with the historical background, which is that in the Dominican Republic, the DLP, which is the Dominican Liberation Party, they have been in power for over 20 years. They are not considered a dictatorship, but people in DR, we feel like it is a dictatorship because it has been the same political party with the same interests for over 20 years. So this is a situation in DR. So the thing about DR is that in 2020, the municipal elections were held, and people began noticing that something was odd with the election polls. So they decided to cancel the elections for the first time in Dominican history. So when this happened, people decided to take the streets and begin protesting because it was very unfair that their elections were being canceled simply because the government couldn't do their job at keeping the elections transparent. So that's when people began protesting, and that leads us to the event, which is our next slide. So the event in the Dominican Republic was mostly that, like I said before, people took the streets in February of 2020. I was around there during that time, and I was very happy to see finally my people, I'm Dominican myself, finally begin protesting for something that we have been angry about for such a long time. So people began protesting. The protests were held for a couple of months, and then finally things were resolved with the election of a new president and transparent elections. So that's a little bit of the history, a little bit of the situation. Now we're almost about to finish, and now let's just jump right over to our conclusion. And we have the resolution right here, like you're seeing, with the election of the new president, who is Luis Abinader, and then the conclusion. So eventually, as you guys see, the most important thing about this protest is that people finally decided to take action. And I feel like taking action is so important. And I think that most of you have seen that especially in last year here in the United States with the George Floyd protests and the Black Lives Matter protests. It is very important to begin taking action. However, I want you to understand that there's never really an actual resolution of many of these events, because nations and governments are always subject to change depending on whoever is leading the country. So it is very important to know that although people started to raise their voices, there's still a long way to go, especially in Latin America. Things will continue to happen. As you can see in these pictures, it is happening in Colombia, Honduras, Ecuador, Bolivia, all over the place. So this is not only exclusive to Venezuela, Chile, and Dominican Republic. So people will continue to raise their voices and demand change, because it is, I think that up to a certain point, we all ask ourselves, to what extent are we responsible for the things that are happening in our country? So that's why we decide to take action. So thank you so much for listening. And if you have any questions, let me know and I will address it at the time.
Okay. All right. We have one more speaker. Great job, Maria. I knew you would be. Great job. So let me stop sharing. Okay, good. Oh, and there does appear to be one question, so let's see if we can get one done now, and then we'll move on to Sarah. Would you say the Caudillo leadership and patronage politics embedded in Maduro's regime? Also, how do you think, okay, there's a few questions, so I think I'm going to let you read that and get on to Sarah, because it is a pretty involved question, and we can answer that hopefully afterwards. Well, we should have some time.
Okay.
Okay.
No
Thank you, Maria. Great job.
Thank you.
All right, so our last speaker is Sarah Urie from Notre Dame, excuse me, of Maryland University. So Sarah, you can share your screen and then you can begin whenever you're ready.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and listening to my presentation. So my presentation is entitled Unjust Justice, and it's an in-depth look on how the Soviet legal system is still affecting Russia today. So I'm going to give a quick overview before I start my presentation so you know what to expect. I'm going to begin speaking on Lenin's legal ideology. I think it's really important when discussing legality and politics that we establish pretty early on that nothing happens in an airtight container. History is very much so a consistent funnel and movement. So in order to discuss what's currently happening, we have to take a look at Soviet legacy. I'm then going to move on to Soviet law, the Khrushchev reforms, Russia's legal system under Putin, and then conclusions that talk about the global implications of the movement, as well as what I've learned and what I'm hoping to continue to research in the future. So, Lenin's Marxist ideology. Ironically enough, Lenin himself was a lawyer. That's how he got the education and was exposed to Marxist ideology. At the time, he believed, and so did Marxism, which is the basis literature for communism, if you're unfamiliar with some of these terms, was a byproduct of a capitalist society. In The State and Revolution, Lenin states that the law is an armed body of men by which the state maintains order over the proletariat. So it was this idea that law kept the proletariat chained down by the bourgeoisie. And so in order to divide the classes, they established law. So in order to join the classes together and create a unified system, they had to get rid of the law. So this is what Lenin went ahead and did. Although in his paper, The Immediate Task of the Soviet Power, he recognized an urgent need to create the conditions in which it will be impossible for the bourgeoisie to exist or for a new bourgeoisie to rise. So in this, he did something that's instrumental and has affected the legal system ever since, and he weaponized the law. So the law for the Bolsheviks had become a means towards an end and an instrument of persecution. So in order to prevent a rise of another bourgeoisie class, they weaponized the law and used it as a way to keep equality. Now, this definitely developed into what we know today as being Soviet law, a law that was expected to serve the interests of the state and leadership. An example of this that I think is really important is the fact that it wasn't just criminal law that was weaponized, it was civil code of law as well. We see this in the facilitated deportment, arrest, and execution of millions of peasants. So it was really truly a industrialization of law in a way that incited fear and control in the general population. Guilt was predetermined, and public trials provided a forum for political agitation and propaganda. You saw your neighbors and your brother and your husband on trial in the middle of city centers. It was a very public event. It was a very political event. Law was no longer about discussing what was right and what was wrong, but more if your loyalty lied with the state or not. And it truly set the stage for future Russian dictators' abuse of power, such as Stalin's Great Terror and the use of the gulags. And this, for Stalin and for Lenin and for a lot of the leaders that would come after him, was a very effective way to control people. If you had the means to send people to the gulags for simply testing the waters of political resistance, then you had a very effective means of controlling the general population very, very well. A great quote is by Martin Lattis, who was a judge under Stalin, and he said, "Do not look in the file of incriminating evidence to see whether or not the accused rose against the Soviets with arms or words. Ask him instead to which class he belongs, what is his background, his education, his professions. These questions will be what determines the fate of the accused." So it really was this matter of, where do your loyalties lie? Where do you identify? And a predisposition of guilt, which is really important for the future of Soviet law and its implication on other authoritative countries, such as North Korea and parts of China. The post-Stalin reforms were, after Stalin's death, a lot of leaders such as Khrushchev set out to rectify Stalinist legal systems and restore a centralist legal system. So they really tried to establish this rule of law and kind of create a more westernized judiciary system. They started this by lifetime appointments of judges by a jury rather than by the dictator. But the continued imprisonment of dissent on false criminal charges that continued under these new rulers really undermined that. It wasn't seen as a huge progression because people were still being imprisoned for things such as speaking out against laws they didn't agree with, and also being imprisoned on false criminal charges. Although the post-Stalin reforms established a use of psychiatric diagnosis as a way to muffle dissent, and as well as new false criminal charges, such as spying on one's country, disloyalty to the government, and treason became really very common charges, as well as like this idea of deporting information was a really effective way to jail foreigners who had come to Russia, such as journalists or diplomats. Now we come to Putin's continuation of Soviet law. Putin used civil unrest in his first term to justify the centralization of executive power, and in this, he completely enveloped the judiciary arm back into a centralization of executive authoritative power. He substantially stalled the growth of the rule of law and started a return back to a more centralist Soviet weaponization of the law. He reinforced the criminal code of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, which was the criminal code under Stalin and under Lenin. A really big thing that Putin did was the de facto right to appoint and fire judges at will. So both federal and local judges were under the power of Putin to appoint and dismiss So if they didn't do as he wished or went against his rulings, they were often dismissed. So there was no real free and fair trials. Human Rights Watch describes Putin's judicial system as confession at any cost. And it's very common that false confessions or coerced confessions were brought up pretty commonly under Putin's presidency. Steve Lee Myers is the Russian reporter for the New York Times, and he said Russia is still a country where suspects can be detained indefinitely, where arbitrary political and even economically motivated prosecutors are common, where coercion of suspects is rampant, and where the police can stop anyone on the street without reasonable cause. In the United States, our legal system is a very big barrier to the over-abuse of power. It's a check of power, so it would make sense that getting rid of it would be a very effective way to gain even more power as an authoritative leader. And this leads me to my conclusions and questions for future research. The historical legacy of the Tsarist regimes, Lenin's communism, Stalin's Russia, and Putin's dictatorship has really shackled the progression of the rule of law and ignited inspiration for China, North Korea, and Cuba to base their judicial systems off of Lenin's judicial structure. So it's really important that we understand that this isn't just a Russia issue, this has become a global issue, and that our judiciary structures globally are under attack and threatened due to the establishment of these sorts of systems. And so my question for future research I am a graduating senior this year who will be continuing my education at law school is there truly a possibility for lasting change in the judicial structure of Russia? And if so, how can I, as a lawyer and a member of the international community, assist in implementing policies that create this lasting, substantial change and really defend our judiciary system globally and domestically? These are my sources. I would be happy to answer any questions, and thank you all for participating and watching.
All right, great job, all for everybody, Sarah. That was awesome. I love the diversity of the different areas of the world that we looked at with this. I thought that was fantastic. We do have about, looks like about, what are we looking at? About 12, 13 minutes left. So if anyone has any questions at this point, Maria, there was that whole long series of questions for you there from Jolisse. Thank you. Thank you to all four of you guys, Jazlynn, Jolisse, Maria, Sarah. I thought you guys all did an unbelievable job. So I'm always amazed by my students, and then coming to a conference like this just makes me that much more amazed from students at all these different colleges. So it's wonderful. So Sarah, if you want to address that question, if you want me to read it, I can. Do you see it? Maria, excuse me.
Yes, definitely. Okay, so Jolisse, she was asking about if I believe that the caudillo leadership and the patronage politics are embedded in Maduro's regime, and I do agree very strongly with that. I do believe that in Maduro's regime, there's definitely a lot of influence from the caudillo leadership, and there is definitely patronage politics in them. So I think that that's probably what makes the Maduro regime so strong and so difficult to tremble. And not only that, but also something that you asked right here, you were saying that Maduro's situation is supported by the Cuban and Chinese government, and that's also something that adds more power to his position in the country, because it is very difficult to try to combat these two forces, which are Cuba and China. So I think that in a way, people have also said that this could potentially lead to some sort of a Cold War, because of the many interests that are involved in this situation. Not only is the communist side with Cuba and China, but there's also the U.S. Because they have in a way stepped in, not very I would say very aggressively, like sending troops over to Venezuela, but they have in a way made arrangements with Juan Guaido so that they can start to do that. Not necessarily maybe send troops, but at least help in the economic situation and help imposing sanctions. So I do believe that they have stepped in. And she also asked if I think that the OAS has the necessary tools to provide humanitarian support. And I think that the OAS might not necessarily have the necessary tools. They have intervened in other situations, especially they intervened in the Dominican Republic with the protests. But I think that their approach is a little bit more diplomatic, and they will not necessarily send humanitarian aid. I think that if anything, if anyone who would say humanitarian aid would probably be the US, by siding with Guaido, or probably other international countries, or potentially the UN. Okay, thank you so much for asking.
Ciao, Maria. Any other questions for any of our the four panelists? Go ahead, Sarah.
Jolisse and Jazlynn, your presentations really went, I think, pretty well together, judging by the fact that you both kind of talked about the trade areas. And I just wanted to ask if either of you kind of saw a new perspective on future research from each other's presentations, and if there was anything like you guys agreed on or saw differently between your two presentations.
One thing that stood out to me was in Jolisse's presentation, you mentioned the political positions and how it's very short term, and like business relations are more significant than political relations. So I mean, that struck a chord with me because I'm sort of studying Chinese culture and language, and so one of the things that came up was in Chinese culture, businessmen, they usually like develop personal relationships first, and by using that, they're able to like have alliances. So it's not really a trade or economic aspect. It's more of going to company dinners, hanging out and talking and having a personal relationship. So I think it's not really a question, but it's just like an observation of how different the cultures are. And it just resonated with Jolisse's presentation about how different their business and political structure is.
I would echo what Jazlynn said. I think our presentations helped bolster one another. I think where I diverge is that I always look in a realist perspective. So I'm always going to be analyzing the military and traditional means of power. I think Jazlynn looks at soft power and diplomatic relations. I'm just obsessed with security and military and anything that has to do with warships.
Yeah, so one of the things that came up was the auditing mechanism, and there are definitely security concerns about, you know, having the UN store all of that data. The security concerns where like you have to implement the, or what is it called, like date the coordinates and how much of the resources were used, what warships are being stored, and things of that nature. So if you have all of that data stored, it could be easily hacked by someone from any country. And with all this nuclear power, it would be a world security concern. So I think by combining our research, it would probably bring in a stronger presentation. That way it's a more holistic approach to resolving international conflict.
All right, excellent. Any other questions for any of our panelists today?
I actually had a question for Sarah. Considering, I would say, both the tradition and the nature of the government in Russia, do you believe that Russia would be, I would say, I guess, lenient towards accepting help from different countries, from the international community? What do you think would be their approach for that? Since you said that you would like to offer your help as a lawyer, as a member of the international community.
Yeah, definitely. So Russia's history has made it very defensive to especially westernized approaches of help. And I think that they see organizations such as the United Nations and the International Criminal Court a kind of a branch, an arm of this westernized influence. So that makes it really difficult to accept help. And kind of, I don't like saying this answer because I feel like it's such a defeatist mindset, but in that you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. You can give them all the tools necessary for meaningful, sustainable change. But until that government sees that as a benefit to them, until they see an independent judiciary as a benefit to them economically, politically, socially, they won't accept it unless it's a change like within their own government structure, which I think is really tragic, because I would love to see a more independent, effective judiciary in Russia. I would love to see that everywhere. I think the judiciary is really important, but I also might be biased because I am a total law nerd. So, but I would love to see that change, but I think it has to be an intrinsic change. And the only way we can do that is by showing that the most effective way to run a country is with an independent judiciary, and that should be something that they want. But at the end of the day, Russia is a beast of a nation when it comes to sovereignty. They are a beast of a nation when it comes to national identity. So any efforts to kind of infiltrate and say, hey, as America or as the global community, we know best, is only going to tick off their internal government. So I really think it has to be a lead by example, a lead by priority, and prioritizing it in our own governments. But I would love to see a change. Who knows if it'll be in my lifetime or not? Never say never, but we'll see what happens. And if one day, the government of Russia calls me up and says that they want me to assist, I would love to.
Exactly. So quick question for you, Sarah. I don't see a lot of news about Russia. So what were the publications or what research sources did you use to get an idea of how Russia was structured?
Yes, that's actually a great question. There was a very high profile trial that just took place with a United States diplomat who was caught with a flash drive of Russian security files, so data on internal Russian affairs, and he was caught and trialed for espionage in the Russian court and was represented by a UN lawyer. And so that actually, Jolisse was in this class with me. We took a class on Russian history, and on our very first day, our professor asked us to find an article about a current event in Russia that we were interested in. And that was the article that I had found, and it really tipped off this whole thing where I saw some of the circumstances of the trial. He was held in prison for almost a year without representation. And I just was like, wow, this is crazy. How are they doing this? How is no one talking about this? There's not enough spotlight on it. And so I started to dig in further and further into the circumstances of the trial and Russian judiciary code. It's pretty easy to get your hands on a lot of Stalin's documents that were released after his death, but some of the more ones under Putin are a lot harder to kind of get an understanding of. But I did a lot of research with the United Nations International Criminal Court at The Hague. They have a really great database for that, as well as a international database for the UN and Interpol have a group website that holds all of the officially published criminal and civil codes for a bunch of different countries. So definitely a lot of nerdy research, digging myself into lines and lines and lines of criminal code. But I suppose 3 years of law school, I should get prepared for that now rather than later. So it's definitely a good introduction to that.
Okay, great. Good answers. Love the questions too. All right, we only have another minute or two left. So I know there's a couple of other events today, and sorry to put Professor McDonald on the spot, but she's so good at announcing these. I've heard her do this a couple of times already today. And since we have her on, I figured I would, since she volunteered me for all this stuff, I'm going to volunteer her for something.
That's fine. I am more than happy. So good afternoon, everybody. I hope you've had a great day of presentations. I just have to say that I'm so impressed with all the student presentations that I've heard all throughout the day. I've been attending things every session, and our keynote speaker today was awesome. So a couple of things to keep in mind. Number one, all the presenters who are in the room should have received an email with a presentation certificate this morning. So if you got your presentation certificate, can I get a thumbs up? All right. If you didn't get it, just let me know, because putting those emails together took a really long time, and I just want to make sure that everybody gets their certificate. So congratulations on your presentation. Two, by Monday, you should get an email with a conference survey. So make sure that you fill out the survey and you give us feedback, because while we do hope to be all together in Philadelphia next year in 2022, I have a feeling that there will probably be some virtual components that we might decide to keep, because there is some flexibility in the virtual environment. So we want to know what we did well here and what could be improved upon. But as Professor Wigatow said, this evening, so you have a little bit of a break. So you can go stretch your legs, go outside, get some fresh air. But at 5 o'clock, our colleagues in the South are holding a panel on diversity. And they have like student activists that are going to be part of that panel. They have a government representative who's going to be an elected official who's going to be part of that panel. All of the details are in the conference program, and the link is in your portal. So that's at 5 o'clock. And that's something that we've never done before. And again, the virtual environment has really given us the opportunity to be able to collaborate with our southern regions. So with our southern region. So if you can drop in and check that out tonight, that would be great. And then for all of the students at 8 o'clock tonight, there will be a Zoom dance party. It's zooming back to the 80s. I don't know how many people have taken part in Zoom dance parties, but I hear they're a lot of fun. And our student representatives have been working really hard on that. And then for any faculty who are in the room at 6:15, there is a faculty staff happy hour event. So feel free to join us for that. Tomorrow morning, don't forget, there's one more session of presentations, session 5, that starts at 9 o'clock. And then we close with our award ceremony tomorrow in terms of the conference weekend. So if anyone has any questions, I can hang out for another minute or two, but congratulations to all the presenters who are here. Thank you to Professor Wigatow for moderating so wonderfully. And I hope that you guys stay well. And thank you again for attending NRHC 2021.
Thank you, Professor
Oh,
McDonald.
and illuminate. You said illuminate. I'm putting the link in the chat. So if you guys wrote papers about your presentations, and you'd like to submit them for consideration to our undergraduate journal Illuminate, I just put the link in the chat. So consider that. The deadline isn't until the end of May, so you have some time if you're not finished writing or you need to edit or whatever the case may be. So I'll turn it back over to you now, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to thank again the 4 participants. I thought you guys were amazing. Thank you to everybody who shared and came in. Thank you for the questions. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Enjoy the rest of your day, and have a good day, everyone. Kat, I have to ask a question. Are those pictures behind you things you did at a paint? I have a couple in our house. Dawn and I went to one, so they look the same kind of style. That's why I was asking. I see them every time, so it's funny.
But thank you for moderating. I really appreciate it.
No problem. It was fun. I look forward to tomorrow.
Yeah, it'll be good. So
Yeah.
maybe, so make sure you get your rest tonight, drink plenty of fluids.
I am. I'm going to try to make the 6:15. I have a family thing I have to go to, but I'm going to try to be back in time to make the 6:15.
Okay. I mean, if you can, I mean, I don't know how well attended that'll be, we'll see, but
Okay.
I'll zoom in. But yeah, so I'll text you later and I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you. Your paintings are better than mine.
Bye, Bruce. Have a good night.
Bye. You too.